You are listening to the Examine Life with Bram Levinson. Hello, everyone. I'm still hanging out here in England, still blown away by how everywhere I look and every time I turn around, it seems like I'm staring at a postcard. Everything is so beautiful here. And it's had me wondering and thinking about really what it is about England, what it is about Paros that I've always believed caused my soul to land in these geographical locations. Like, what is it about these places that makes me feel like, I don't know, so grateful to be there and like wanting to stay there for as long as I can. And I think it is the beauty. I think it's because everywhere you look there is just, well, it's also different. It's very different from where where my home base is. But just gorgeous and stunning and almost a forced mindfulness practice to be where I am, or at least to cognitively be where my body is. Because as we all know, your body can be anywhere in the world, but if your mind is somewhere else, then that's where you are. We are where our mind is. It doesn't matter where the body is. And so when I come to these places, I realize it's harder for my mind to wander when I'm surrounded by the sights and the sounds and the smells and the tastes and the feels of these places. And something that I've found really interesting is that even when you are in these geographical locations where the beauty is abundant and the abundance is abundant and the muchness is everywhere, there will still be moments where the mind does its thing and it starts to wander away and starts to fall into psychological time. And psychological time simply being, past, future, what if. When the mind wanders into what has been, when the mind starts to project into a future that has not happened and that is at best uncertain. When we start going down that rabbit hole of possibilities, usually the ones that don't end well, that's psychological time. And no matter where you are, no matter how immersed in the things that resonate with you and that sort of wake up your alertness, no matter where you are and what's happening, there will be moments where the psychological time happens. And as I have mentioned, working with a lot of my wellness coaching clients, psychological time rarely ends up, helping. Psychological time is usually what brings us into the anxiety and into the rumination and into, the worry. And so, the greatest mindfulness practice is to notice, to be present, to be mindful of when you fall into psychological time. And notice when that happens that the only real way to respond to it is to simply bring yourself back cognitively to what is now. Whatever the now is, that eternal now that is always different and that's always changing, because the now is always different. When we come back into the now, there are a couple of questions we could ask ourselves, like, isn't everything great in this second? Aren't I comfortable? Aren't I safe? Aren't I warm? Is there anything to worry about right now in this second? And usually the answer is no. Usually that practice just brings us back to, oh, okay, I went there again. I allowed the mind to control me and I went there again, so let's stay here. And what I have learned throughout the years, a really, really good lesson that I learned simultaneous to a bunch of my students was, I think it was in September 2020. I think it was September 2020. It was a break between lockdowns back home. And I organized a weekend yoga and meditation retreat up in the countryside. And we had this beautiful area, this little kind of, how can I describe it? Its own freestanding studio for us to practice in the middle of the forest. And it was about an hour into the practice, and everybody had finished with movement, and everyone was sitting or lying down and just beginning the practice of stillness and the practice of direction of attention, of mindfulness, of meditation. And a hush descended on the room. I said that like my mother was telling the story. My mother has this proclivity towards exaggerating details, even about stories that she was not there for firsthand. So I think that the apple doesn't fall far from the tree. But anyway, it was quiet in the room. And all of a sudden, as everybody was just sitting and breathing, and there was this like blanket of stillness, all of a sudden you heard like on the side of the building, on the side of the wall, the building that we were in. And it kept going. Like it would happen and then stop, and then happen and then stop. And I remember silently, I'm trying to hold space for everybody. I'm trying to, I don't know, direct, if I can, the vibe as much as I can. And I'm hearing this. And I remember just thinking, what the fuck is going on? Is someone actually doing construction on the side of the, it's, I don't know, 8 a.m. They know we're here. What is going on here? And very quickly, it felt like an eternity, but it was probably about 30 seconds, 45 seconds later, I realized it wasn't somebody drilling, it was a woodpecker. It was a woodpecker that was, doing its thing on the side of the building. And I guess as the realization dawned on me, it was dawning on the students as well. Some of you who may be listening right now. And so I sort of I cracked my eyes open a little bit, and I could see everybody sitting in front of me and, in position, but I could see them trying not to laugh. The smiles trying to crack on their faces, and they were trying to keep it in. They were trying to maintain this blanket of stillness and quiet. And I just opened my eyes and I said, okay, listen, open your eyes, listen. Number one, best laid plans, life is going to happen. And number two, the lesson right now isn't necessarily through the meditation. The lesson is through this woodpecker, which is obviously, trying to teach us something. Life is trying to teach us something right now in this moment. And that is that there is always going to be a fucking woodpecker. And that's really the motto that I live my life by now, is no matter what is going on, no matter how beautiful things are, no matter how well things seem to be going, there's always going to be a fucking woodpecker. And what that means is there's always going to be something to pull you into, to pull you below the line. That's just a thought away. There's always going to be someone stirring shit up in your awareness, maybe in your immediate environment, just cause. There's always going to be something. There's always something that can pull us into negative thought patterns, negative speech patterns, negative behavioral patterns. And it is, I believe, our responsibility. And listen, I think this is one of the meanings of life, if there are any. But it is our responsibility to have this mindfulness practice, this daily, hour by hour, almost minute by minute mindfulness practice of recognizing those things, those thoughts, those events, those situations, those woodpeckers, and recognizing that it's a test. It's a test. It's a test to see if we can, put it into context and put it into perspective and recognize, okay, this is, but it's not the totality. And in any given moment, we have the opportunity as to whether we get pulled into the woodpecker or not. Because I believe that the meaning of life is to transcend suffering in the presence of all the things that would pull us into suffering. I believe that we are, and by the way, I'm not saying negate or ignore or suppress or repress whatever seems negative or presents as, destabilizing. I'm simply saying, in the presence of those things, recognize those things, be with those things, feel those things, and then what? And then redirect attention. The quality of life is going to be dependent on what we focus on. And if we're focusing on the fucking woodpecker, it's always going to be about the woodpecker. And it's a test. It's a lesson that we all have to learn. There's Ralph, the Irish Terrier, who's barking at a bird on the roof. Come here, Ralph. Come here. Yeah, wants nothing to do with me. So Ralph needs to learn this lesson that there's always going to be a fucking woodpecker. It may not be the bird that was landing on the roof, but I did see one the other day over here, so could be. Ralph is very much distracted by the woodpeckers, so don't be like Ralph, all right? That's really the lesson. There's always going to be a fucking woodpecker, and sometimes, if you live in a densely populated area, or not even, and you've got like a neighbor who just is loud or doesn't respect rules or is always doing construction, okay, there's your woodpecker. And if you've got a family member that's always in conflict, if there's polarity in the system that is your family, okay, woodpecker. And listen, it could be a negative thought pattern that you are very used to. It could be the thought pattern of, I'm not good enough, or this isn't going to work out, or, the world is a horrible place. Whatever the thought is, that's your woodpecker. And ultimately, I'm not saying ignore any of these things, because they are. Life is happening. Everything that arises within one's awareness is simply life expressing itself as itself. But what I am saying is, be mindful of what you allow your mind to rest on, because that is going to dictate the quality of your experience. I've gotten so much better at being able to be present to when my mind is going there, to recognize that it's not helpful, to bring it back. And by the way, be careful that you don't fall into some sort of spiritual bypass, or just like over psychological bypass, where you don't take accountability for your role in things, because it's really easy to stir shit up and then start worrying about what the after effects are going to be, and then pull yourself into the present moment and ask yourself, okay, well, right now things are good, right? Listen, that adage, take no shit, do no harm, that's a thing. I try to live my life by that adage. And listen, occasionally there is failure. Occasionally I do hurt. And the last thing I'm going to do is try to avoid whatever the fallout is, or whatever the repercussions are, or whatever my responsibility is in that equation. But with that said, I think that every one of us could benefit from recognizing when we're being pulled down the rabbit hole of thinking about stuff that has really no bearing on anything, on the past, the present, the future. It's simply a waste of our cognitive time. And again, if you are where your mind is, if we are where the mind is, that means that whatever we're worrying about is where we are. It doesn't matter where the body is. So you could have waited years to take that vacation. You finally get to that geographical place, and all you're doing is worrying about that thing, worrying about the woodpecker, letting the woodpecker and just fuck with you. Well, listen, could have saved the money, could have saved the time, could have stayed home, right? Worried at home. There's always going to be a fucking woodpecker. And you know what? I think that laugh that I just gave, that's just evidence that I'm learning. Not even to take the woodpeckers too seriously. Because you know what? Another thought I've had here is, what if there is no getting it wrong? What if even focusing on the woodpecker isn't necessarily a bad thing? I'm very into letting the experience of life be as great as it can be. And so, yes, I have been known to not demonize, but give less value to the worry and the stress and the anxiety and all that stuff, because it lands as discomfort, right? But what if there is no getting it wrong? What if when we do spend too much time on the woodpecker, okay, we spent too much time on the woodpecker, and maybe that in itself is its own mindfulness lesson. I guess it comes down to what you want out of life, what one wants from one's experience of life. And I want to squeeze all the juice out of life. I want to live what is to be lived, and I want to see the sights and taste the tastes and feel all the feels. And for me, anyway, that requires not spending too much time beating the crap out of myself, recognizing those woodpeckers, laughing when they present, and really sort of laughing at the folly of all the different incarnations and iterations that the woodpecker presents as. Because, I mean, really, it's endless. It's endless. And that's why I believe that is our life's work, to transcend the suffering, because there's, right now especially, it seems like anyway, there's so many things that could pull us into suffering, into negative thinking, into division and isolation and loneliness and desperation and hopelessness. And that's easy. That's the easy thing to do. The easy thing to do is to be manipulated by the woodpecker and just give up. And I'm not going to fucking give up. And I don't want you to give up. I want you to recognize the woodpecker. I want you to recognize that the woodpecker is just a trick. Move around the woodpecker. Don't give too much time to the woodpecker. And listen, as the Bhagavad Gita tells us, there are demons among us. There are going to be people who are woodpeckers. There are going to be people who have not processed their own issues, their own trauma, their own hurt. And so they'll take it out on everyone else. And there's a lot of that going on. And I understand it from a spiritual point of view, from a psychological point of view. I totally get it. Doesn't change the fact that there's some motherfuckers in the midst of us. And I think that let's just leave them, move around them, let them do their thing, let them figure it out. Hopefully they will. Whether or not they will, none of my fucking business. My business is to make sure that I'm good, and to do whatever I can to make sure that I'm good, and that I'm living this life according to however I feel the need to live it, so that if I'm given that moment at the end of life to look back on life, I can think, wow, I did it. There's not much there that I'm regretting. I took the chances. I asked for what I wanted. I did the things. I ate the food. You know. I think that's what it's about. So, little food for thought, a little contemplation perhaps for you. Ask yourself, what are your woodpeckers? What are those things that constantly pull you down, threaten to pull you below the line? What are those things? And can you recognize that even though there's probably nothing wrong with the time and the energy that you have spent being controlled by these things, by these woodpeckers, can you consider that maybe there's a different way of responding? Maybe the response is, okay, I see you, I hear you, I feel you, wonderful, you are. And then focusing on what else exists in the totality. And connecting to all of it. Because again, the mind is going to tend towards the negative on its own psychological default. So if there is no mindfulness practice, that means that by default, we are simply being distracted by the stuff that is disturbing. So let's be awake. Let's have some agency. Let's have a choice. Let's celebrate the woodpecker, because the woodpecker is our teacher. And then transcend the woodpecker. Anyway, give it a think. Let me know what you think. Feel free to reach out through social media, through email, through however we communicate. The most important thing, and you've probably heard me say this countless times, enjoy your life. Make the most of the time you have with this mind and this body, and enjoy your life. Talk to you soon. This has been the Examine Life with Bram Levinson.